So before I invite our wonderful guests up to take part in this panel discussion, I wanted to bring one word into the room, and that word is liminal. So you may or may not have heard of it. To me, it's a beautiful word. This word liminal speaks to that transitional stage between the old and the new, between the known and the unknown. It speaks to that gap in between the old world and the new world, where previous norms are almost dissolving, at least temporarily, and what is to come has yet to be defined or solidified. And I would say, based on the way that the status quo has been shaken up over recent times, we're definitely in a liminal space. And now, a liminal space can be challenging and it can be uncomfortable because, in effect, you've got like one foot in the old world that's dissolving, one foot in this new world that hasn't yet formed, and so you're not really standing on solid ground. But because of that, things are a lot more malleable, and so you're presented with an opportunity during this liminal phase, a really ripe opportunity to reshape things in new ways and hopefully better ways. So to reshape, our lives, our cultures, our societies. And I think this definitely applies to the workplace as well, how we think about work, how we show up at work. And so I think this is certainly an opportunity that we are presented with today. But, as Nick mentioned, there's obviously a confluence of macro crises and challenges as well happening right now that are negatively impacting people's mental health and their well-being. And so it's this tension, as it were, and this context that we'll be thinking about when we move into this panel discussion today. And so on that note, I would like to invite Arti from the Ocado group up onto the stage or the floor, Rebecca from John Lewis Partners, and Nick from Culture Amp. Okay, so I'm going to ask the three of you to introduce yourselves to the audience. Obviously, your professional background, but also what you hope to bring to this conversation today.
I was hoping that everyone else would set the scene. So hi, everyone. My name is Arti Kashyap-Aynsley. I'm the Global Head of Health and Wellbeing for the Ocado Group. And to give you a taste of my background, I guess I have a bit of a different background than most would anticipate for anyone that sits in a seat like mine. So my background is in professional services. So I'm a chartered accountant by trade, and I've spent 5 years with PwC working between audit, tax, and advisory. Clearly don't know how to work a microphone. And then I spent the bulk of my career at Deloitte in management consulting, where I was a finance consultant. And as I worked through the ranks and across the globe and got to see what that lifestyle could do to someone, it really shifted my mind and my perspective to this idea of workplace well-being. I didn't realize that I could have a role or a job in it, but life has told me that that is possible, and that's how I'm here today. For today's conversation, I hope to bring a different perspective than my colleagues that I'm sitting with, but equally shared perspectives that I'm sure a lot of us have in the room.
Thank you, Arti. And Rebecca.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Rebecca from the John Lewis Partnership. I've got quite a sort of strange background, really. So in my professional career, I've spent 13 years working in different retail businesses in human resources, the last bit of that being at Pret a Manger, where I was head of HR. And I've then moved into hospitality for 13 years at Pret, sort of changed careers at Pret and moved across before moving into Waitrose and then into John Lewis more holistically. But actually my education in this space started in my formative years. My father was a funeral director, and from being about 13 years old, I was taught to deal with bereaved families, and at 13 that is quite something. And I got a bit of a taste for it, for helping people when they're in their worst possible space. So really keen to be in the role that I'm in now as Head of Wellbeing for John Lewis.
Thank you, Rebecca. Finally, Nick.
Hi. So Nick Matthews, I work for Culture Amp, but from a personal level, just starting there, I was actually thinking back to what Nick was saying about the whole person. I've got a 10-month-old that's in a sleep regression at the moment, so one of my circles is a little bit fuzzy, so forgive me today. And also, just on a personal level, so I had a fairly significant mental health challenge around 10 years ago, which, if you can see my hair, give some evidence of that. And so it's been something that on a personal level has been a real focus for me and a passion. But from a professional side of things, so Culture Amp, we're an Australian HR tech employee experience platform. We have about 1,000 employees around the world and work with about 6,500 organizations, really focusing on that overall kind of employee experience.
Thank you so much. So, given these multi-crises happening right now, it's really important that we support our employees in the workplace rather than, unintentionally through the workplace throw further fuel onto the fire, as it were. And so for me, the most, a compassionate question for us all to ask is, how can we create workplace cultures that feel psychologically safe rather than the opposite? Because we know that employees are struggling. And so, Nick, I thought we could start with you. Perhaps you can, bring this to life for us. If you could share some key bits of insight from recent Culture Amp data around the topic of mental health and well-being in the workplace.
Sure. So we're a data platform in essence, and we did a survey recently of about 3,000 sort of employees around Europe. And again, going back to what Nick said earlier, only 39%, well, actually, sort of 39% of employees felt that their, organisation really cared about mental health. So that just shows you there's a huge, huge way to go. And that was taken, this is only sort of a couple of months ago, even after everything in the pandemic. And there were some other kind of nuances within that, specifically around gender, which was fascinating, but also from a kind of from a geographical perspective. So we also found out that in the UK, 40% of respondents have imposter syndrome in the UK. It was only 30% in France and only 20% in Germany. So there's something also specifically about sort of the UK sort of economy and society that we're in that has led to that happening. And so I think that provides some really interesting context to, I think, kind of what we're talking about today.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it doesn't paint the rosiest of pictures. Things are tough right now. And so, Arti and Rebecca, I'd love to know from you, like within your organizations, what are the specific challenges that you are being faced with when it comes to mental health and well-being? And also, like, what are you choosing to direct your attention and resources to specifically? And we'll start with you, Arti. I think it's good.
That's good, yeah. So yeah, for us, there's probably a couple challenges. One is that Ocado has grown. I think in the UK, most people will know Ocado as a UK retailer that serves groceries. But actually, globally, we are a technology solutions provider. And so we have grown quite organically, but quite quickly globally. And so for us, there's an element of reach and cascading messages that we're doing. So how do we get that level of culture that we're trying to create in the UK that is very family oriented and very sort of startup and circulated around the sense of us all being together, in it together? And how do we get that translated to all the other regions that are just starting to grow and perhaps feel less connected to the center? So that's probably one challenge. The second has been around support and how we get this consistent level of support. So because of the way that we've grown, we've kind of grown like a lot of organizations, which is just sort of like, let's react and just like, oh, we need to stick that there, we need to stick that there, we need to try this, do that. And there's been some really great effort around some of the things that we've done, but nothing necessarily matches the sense of what it should look like for a FTSE 50 company. And so I think for us, it's been about stepping back and being like, right, what's the way that we can, one, offer a consistent level of approach and a consistent level of support, to all of our people globally, and put everyone sort of on that same level playing field. How can we connect everyone so that this sense of family and this in it together and this level of psychological safety that people definitely feel in the UK office, which you feel when you walk into the office or any of the fulfillment centers or spokes that we have, how do we translate that to the other countries? And then also how do we get people, like, how do we get people to start opening up and creating a conversation? And that's kind of where we've been putting a lot of our efforts. I think the focus has been a lot on looking at what that support mechanism is, and how we do that and what that means in terms of partners we work with and providers and so forth. The second thing has been around how do we create some sort of a framework around champions that helps us cascade that messaging and that level of support. And actually, as we approach World Mental Health Day, we are coming close to launching that framework, which is around 60 to 70 people globally that have just been being trained over the last 4 to 6 weeks so that they are able to kind of go into that. But that's really been the focus, and it's been also this level of stopping the reactionary, we need to just do this right now, and getting people to step back for the site, like listening to that idea of to go fast is to go slow, and have more of a concerted approach.
It sounds like you're taking a proactive approach, and also it sounds whole organizational, which is fantastic. And Rebecca, I'd love to hear, like, do you have some resonance with that? Like, what do things look like at John Lewis?
Definitely. I mean, there's no doubt we were wired slightly differently as a business. So we are a co-owned business, which means that all of our employees are partners who own a proportion of the business. And I think it's part of our DNA that partners care for other partners. So there's a real sort of conscious choice there to care about other people that you work with. And that extends beyond our organisation into communities. So we do quite a lot of work within the communities surrounding our locations to help people in those communities who we know because they shop with us day in, day out, and we form relationships with them. But there's a big difference between caring and acting. And it's easier to care than it is to act, particularly when you're trying to trade, and particularly when you're trying to trade in an environment which is critical to the nation. You know, providing food for people, particularly during COVID, was a critical activity. And trying to balance that need to trade and trade well and have food on the shelves and care for people at the same time who are also struggling to sort of cope with whether it's COVID or cost of living and so on is really tough. And my fear at the moment is, and I think this sort of reflects some of what you were saying, is that we've been quite lucky, in a sense. We've had two really hot topics in this space. COVID, followed by a cost of living crisis, which means that, you know, our managers are all ears and want to help and want to support their partners because they can see the impact it's having. When that changes, and hopefully one day, you know, we get back to a little bit of normality and there's not quite so many crises at once, how will we keep up that momentum? Will people care as much then? So at the moment, we're in the spotlight. It's easier. When the spotlight turns to something else, who will care?
That's really important, and I think it comes back to what I was mentioning earlier. This is the opportunity to really lay new foundations, as it were, for when things go back to one day, hopefully normal. Again, and you mentioned some really great things, like, you know, there's a difference between just caring and acting, and it needs to be, you know, effective caring, as it were. And as we've discussed, you know, this whole person, whole organization approach does seem to be the most effective approach to take. And I think that is equally relevant to the topic today, psychological safety. You know, if we think from the whole person perspective, obviously psychological safety is when a person feels safe to bring their whole person, their whole self to work, you know, rather than having to hide or ignore aspects of their identity or their perspectives on things. And then from the whole organization approach, psychological safety is experienced at the group level. It requires the whole organization. It's something that we effectively give to each other. And so, you know, with that in mind, it's important to acknowledge that this is a whole organization thing, definitely. But it's probably equally important to acknowledge that leaders and managers have a disproportionately influential role to play when it comes to creating these kinds of cultures that we are talking about. And so, I guess, Arti, starting with you, how do you have these kinds of conversations with senior leaders? You know, how do you get their buy-in? How do you let them know how important a role that they play when it comes to something like psychological safety?
I mean, I have two perspectives of this, right? So I came from over a decade of working at Deloitte, and at Deloitte, it's a partner structure. So, you know, you have 1,000 partners, say, you penetrate 10 of them, and that can have a massive influence. Coming into industry where you have an executive director level that is maybe, you know, 10 people, permeating just one isn't often enough because they become then the poster child for those conversations. And what I would say is Ocado is on a journey. We have made a massive stride, I think, in the last 18 months, and you are definitely seeing the shifts and change with how the executive directors, the board, are really owning the conversation. But I guess my controversial view is that in organizations like ours, where the demographics are a lot very heavy in millennial generation, is that sometimes that change has to happen from them. And I think sometimes often we put a lot of the pressure on these senior leaders, which I don't negate that they have an accountability, But actually, what we're then doing is putting the parent-adult-child model directly into the workforce. And what we're saying is that as leaders, you play this really big parent scary role, which is that you must own and you must create this for your children. But actually, at the heart of it, we're all adults going to a virtual or physical office every day. And all of us have an accountability to play. And so some of that conversation, I'm starting to see that level of psychological safety, and I definitely saw it when I was at Deloitte, like in the projects that I sat on, the level of safety I got was from my peer network, was from, who was the other person I grabbed when a client yelled at me and I was like, I'm going to cry in the bathroom, come with me. And I had someone to stand with. That wasn't necessarily my manager. And it isn't the same at Ocado. You see it in people, whether they're in a CFC, whether they're in like an office structure. We have a peer-to-peer network on Slack, and you see so much conversation around, I've just had a really bad day today, I need someone to talk to. And that level of I have someone to go to is really the sense of like what drives that psychological safety. So I feel like I just totally went 360 against your question, but I guess I just don't play into the model that leaders and managers are the only ones to have a role to play, because I think we are then setting a bad standard in organizations.
No, I mean, I agree with that. You're inviting people to show up as adult and adult rather than this paternalistic approach, 100%. I guess you would agree still, though, that a leader and a manager can either have a negative or a positive impact on that culture of psych safety, and a disproportionately influential one.
Of course. And the thing is that there's one level of what's the safety I feel because I feel like I have a strong network. The other is what's my progression in an organization. And people are going to follow what they see, not what you say. And if you want people to grow in an organization and to have long-lasting careers, and you want to look at more things like succession planning and so on and so forth, then you have to think about what are you making aspirational for people. And if people aren't authentic leaders at that level, and they aren't driving some of these more compassionate topics and discussions, then you are very easily going to sway and have people move from organization to organization. I mean, people work for leaders, they don't work for organizations.
Yeah, definitely. And Rebecca, do you have anything to add to what Arti said there? And specifically, I'd like to add to that also how you've leveraged the power that managers have at John Lewis, and how have you empowered and supported them to create psychologically safe cultures?
Yeah, so we've got a sort of whole organisation purpose, which is not about making money, actually. It's about happier people, happier business, happier world. So it sings to both, we want our partners to have a great experience at work, we want our customers to have a wonderful time when they're interacting with our business through whatever platform they're using, and we want the communities in which we work to benefit from our endeavours as well. So there's that kind of higher purpose that galvanizes the whole organisation together, and of course some people are more galvanized than others, but this is natural. And then I think what we're trying to do is very much that adult relationship. So we are focusing on training our people managers, so line managers, in not how to fix somebody and not the sort of first aid approach, but in how to spot the signs, the practical signs, the easy to read signs that someone is starting to struggle or is not in the best place they could be in. So it might be just change of behaviour. It might be, that they sort of seem different, but realising that those are not just necessarily people having a bad day, but people who might need a bit more support or a bit more intervention. So the sort of signals is what we're sort of trying to encourage. And we're very focused on holistic well-being. So, mental health for me is one piece in a puzzle. I sort of like the Venn diagram earlier. We have a sort of a definition of well-being in the partnership that we've just sort of been bringing in, which is simpler than our previous definition. And we focus on body and mind, life and soul. And our biggest focus is on soul. So proactively, we're trying to encourage partners to participate in activities that are not work. So we're encouraging partners to enjoy some of the holiday spaces that we're lucky to have, to get involved in events in the community, to volunteer to be wellbeing champions in their locations and help other partners. And the sort of principle that we're following is that we want to enable and inspire partners to create happiness for others, as opposed to organisationally trying to make everybody happy, because you can't do that.
I think that's really great. I think both you and Arti have raised an important thing here. the ideal approach is not to think of in terms of we need to help, some of this paternalistic relationship. It's how can we, I think you used the words, enable and inspire people to tap into their own agency to create well-being for themselves, and then to co-create a culture depending on their own sphere of influence that supports people in that organization, which I think is a healthier and more mature way of looking at this problem, which I think is great. Nick, I'm sure you've got some great insight to bring to this, and I'll bring it back to, I'm sure there are people leaders or anyone for that matter who might have to make the case, I mean these days maybe not as much, but might have to make the case for something like psychological safety in the workplace. What could you share that people could draw on to be able to make that case well?
Yeah. So big tech companies get a sort of bad rap nowadays, and you've seen a whole lot of stuff this week around social media and mental health and sort of the downsides of that. But as organizations themselves, they've actually, I think, been ahead of the game in this. So in 2012, so over 10 years ago, Google actually ran an internal project called Project Aristotle, which was looking at this whole concept of saying what makes a high-performing team. And what they uncovered from doing all of that research internally was that psychological safety was the #1 thing to create high-performing teams. So this is 2012. And so for me, that sort of, you bring it back to that, and we have a whole sort of team effectiveness survey that is based off creating that psychological safety. And I think if you think about it, it's exactly what you just said as well, around and allowing people to speak to each other and to have that friend at work, and to be able to kind of share that sort of those feelings and that safe space. And so I think a lot of organizations should, again, absolutely be focusing on that aspect and that sort of the organizational level. And I think what's been fascinating, and again, for there's probably a whole range of organizations that are sitting out here now, we've done some additional research recently where I think we had about 2.5 million responses to some of the internal surveys that we roll out, and we did some correlation analysis. And what we found was that in those organizations that do a lot of hiring, you can think about that, versus those organizations where maybe there's a bit more of a stable population. Obviously, those organizations with a stable population, psychological safety was a lot higher. Now, why is that? Because it's the same people. You come into work each day and you have those same colleagues. When if you're in an organization that is hiring lots of people, transient workers, kind of gig workers, it's actually a lot harder to do that, because you turn up for work and every day there's a different person. And you won't instantly go into that conversation and share your whole person with that. And so I think it's about knowing where you are as an organization and sort of measuring that before you start on that journey, because there are some structural things that make it easier to go on that journey towards psychological safety, versus, as you say, knowing where you are and going, actually there's some things we might need to sort of tackle first of all.
And Rebecca, I think you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, during COVID in particular, and some of this had happened before, but during COVID, we started to create wellbeing spaces in some of our branches, and during the cost of living crisis now, we're seeing some of those wellbeing spaces turned into pantries, where people can come and sort of give and take for either themselves or the community. So we have people sort of taking things for their elderly next door neighbours and so on, and it might be, a can of beans and a packet of pasta, but it really helps that person. But the thing I was going to say was that we've moved from people being, I think, afraid to talk about mental health challenges, and actually in our organisation people are afraid to talk about financial hardship challenges. There's a real sort of step that you have to get over before someone will seek support, which is pride. And there's a bigger sense of pride around finances than there was a stigma around mental health, I think. So we're kind of going round the loop again of having to really encourage people to come forwards for help, and almost to the extent that we're almost making it with the wellbeing rooms, we sort of ended up making it a reward to spend time in the wellbeing room, so that it was seen as something more joyous and less medical. Actually, you've really worked out of your skin this morning. Why don't you go off on your break early, have 15-20 minutes in the wellbeing room, put some music on, relax, chill out. And that really helped, because it wasn't seen as you need to go to the medical room. You have to break down a lot of barriers in that space, I think.
And that speaks again to psychological safety, right? Being able to feel safe to speak about whatever your challenges might be. So on that note, like everything you've been describing, again, it does sound like this whole organization approach. What are some of the key challenges that you've had to face, and be it at an individual level or a team level or an organizational level, and through facing and hopefully overcoming those, like what lessons have you learned that might be helpful for people? So, Arti.
I mean, I think some of the challenges are things that I've already talked about around like consistency from a global perspective. But I think one thing for sure, especially in a global organization, is the language that you use and understanding what the nuances are in each country. So like understanding that actually in countries like Poland, they don't believe in talking about mental health in the workplace. And actually when you do, you're responded with, that's a psychologist or a therapist's job, not mine. So it's understanding, it's like one, you might have a global view of what that looks like, but then it's meeting each country where they are and understanding those cultural nuances. And that means that you have to spend a lot more time in each of the countries or be able to lean on the support that you have in each of those countries to get a sense of, is this campaign that we want to run, is the language the right language? And should we change, the text on this poster to this language and so on and so forth. So that's definitely been a challenge. I just leave that one for now. Yeah.
I think, as Nick mentioned earlier, it's not a simple problem to solve, right? Rebecca?
Yeah, I think it's weirdly it's language for us as well. We were talking to partners. I've only been in my current role for 8 months, and I'm sort of, I suppose, upsetting the apple cart a little bit. But we were talking to partners about having financial education. I mean, I cannot imagine anything more painful than that, and I would definitely not go to a session on financial education. But talking to them about how to make the most of your money, do you want more cash at the end of the month? Suddenly you've got a different audience. And also, I think there's an order of play in this space that, we have a lot of people who are struggling, but have a history of struggling and haven't perhaps made the best choices because they didn't know any better in the first place, so are less able to weather the storm. But now is not the time to talk to them about education. They are in crisis. So we are working on helping them financially out of the crisis level, and we'll expect them to attend some useful groups to enable them to budget and plan better in future on the back end of that. So it's the order of play, and when someone's in that moment and stressed out about how they're going to feed their children this week, you don't talk to them about education and doing it better. It's the language around it and the order in which you go, I think.
I think there's this general sense of meeting the person where they are and understanding that your audience is very varied. So another one for us is definitely the fact that, we have leaders that don't understand the connection between mental and physical health. And for someone that works in the space, you're just like, I don't understand why you don't see that. But actually the reality is everyone is at a different place. And it's therefore then understanding that how do you then transpire the things that you're doing so that you get that uptake and engagement that you want.
Definitely. Both really important points. Like, Nick, do you have anything to add to this before we move to some audience Q&A? So I think now's a good time to do that. So if you have any questions, and I have a few more questions to ask you towards the end, but if you have any questions you'd like to ask our guests, please just raise your hand. Yes.
I'll be the first one. I think something you said, which I think is really powerful about the fact that, the different cultures. And I'm curious to know, going even one step further, are you finding that, because it's something I find is, we talk a lot about mental health, but actually we even start to classify and go deeper down to recognize how certain people from different cultures, different backgrounds, ethnicities, for them, it's even more of a challenge. And if you then add the cost of living crisis to that, so now you're dealing with an ED&I issue and a mental health issue. And I wonder where often we, when we talk about mental health, it's often a certain type of person often talking about it. What are we doing to really dig even deeper down? What are the stats showing us from the different levels? So those percentages, what are we seeing about that ED&I element as well? Sorry, big question.
No. I won't have any data, but I'm sure Nick will. I'll just call it out. I'm an ethnic minority female working in the mental health space. Do you know what that was like, going home and explaining that to my parents? From like a culture where like you just don't talk about these things and you sweep everything under the rug. Like my parents now, it's funny because my dad will be the one that sends me, I read this article on mental health. But the years that it's taken to get to that point is hard. And I was a chartered accountant, so I come from like exactly what they expected me to become to like the complete opposite, right? And it's that you raise such a good point, because that's why there has to be such an intersectionality between the topics that we have to link, right? So we can't just talk about health and well-being on its own, because the level at which it integrates with inclusion. I think I read a quote, or I heard someone say the other day, that well-being, the birthplace of well-being is inclusion. And it's true, because you can't just take a topic like financial well-being, for example, and say this is the blanket, because you have to think about what's the socioeconomic background, what's the other demographic that we need to think about, the age, the ethnicity, all of that kind of stuff. You can't talk about these things in a silo. The ESG agenda and that social element connects all these topics, and it's trying to pin all of them together.
You raised some amazing points there. You've got a question, Bruce?
Sorry, I didn't realise
Yeah, we'll come back to you right now.
I was just going to double down on intersectionality is, I think, the crucial part of it. And I think the other thing is one of the things that we've seen work really well internally, because we're 1,000 people and we're across the US, Australia, and Europe, is our internal employee resource groups. And it's been fascinating to watch. We call it Camp ID, Inclusive Disabilities. And just watching that kind of it was the slowest one to get going, because no one was really willing to sort of step out and put their kind of hand up. But now, with sort of leadership and sponsorship, it's now becoming actually one of the fastest growing ERGs that we have. And within that, I just witness every day the intersectionality. And it's just a lesson every day, and thinking, I never thought of that, of what that situation would mean. And so I think creating spaces internally in organisations to get that sort of qualitative data as well. That's something that I would heartily recommend, because it's provided so much colour to that sort of data insight that we would see as well. And I think you need both, but that's something that we've been very, very focused on.
Great. Thank you. Bruce, you had a question? Someone else had a question? Yeah. Yes. Sorry.
Really very interesting content for everything that's been said. Rebecca, I was interested, you said it's easy to care, it's harder to act. And I come from an organisation with 0 money and a global with 10,000 people. So I would be very interested in one top tip from everyone of the most effective intervention, which was low remain cost, that really made a difference to colleagues.
I think for me, it's.
So I'm just going to repeat that question, but I think perhaps some people didn't hear in the audience. Is that correct? So the question in a nutshell was, could each of our panel guests share one low-cost intervention that has been effective in their organization, really impactful? With the context being, it's not just about caring, but the action is so important.
So we've asked all of our partners for our Q4, which we're just stepping into now, to focus on acts of kindness, which is, a well-known thing. And I think almost because of the cost of living crisis, there's more momentum behind it already. So we had an example the other day of one of our partners who works in one of our Waitrose cafes, who noticed that one of the customers was coming to the cafe without his wife, and sadly the wife had passed away. And without saying anything, the following week, when the gentleman came in and sat down to have his breakfast in the cafe, the partner asked his manager if he could go on his break early, went and bought his own breakfast in the cafe and sat down with the customer. And we were all in floods of tears at this. I'm welling up now thinking about it. But that was then, and I relentlessly publicised across the organisation as this is what we mean by acts of kindness. It was heartfelt. No one made a big song and dance about it. When we publicised it, the partner was like, "Oh my God, no, this is embarrassing." But it's good to demonstrate through stories and through examples of people doing stuff in their everyday roles that has that kind of visceral impact. And my God, the whole of that team were like, "We need to do more. We need to do more like Harry did," And it's important to have those examples, I think.
I love that. It's just quickly to say, just shows that it can be the simple human things that are so important, and just how important role modeling is as well. We can be a source of inspiration for others. I love that. Arti.
I think I'm going to piggyback a little bit on yours, but also steal Nick's. I think employee resource groups are great, and they generate a sense of community and safety. At Ocado before, when I joined, they had a ERG dedicated to mental health, and when we reframed everything as health and well-being and put everything under the banner, we translated that group into peer-to-peer support, and then created a new ERG centered around health and well-being. And the conversations in the mental health channel around that peer-to-peer support and that sense of, I'm just having a really bad day, or I found this really great article, or I went and I tried this new therapy and it really helped me. It's really beautiful to watch, because you see people opening up, and you know that then they feel like they have a sense of security and safety. And then they then start to feel like, oh, the organization actually cares because they're creating this space. And it's that ripple effect, right? Then they tell someone, oh, I got some really great support from here, so somebody else joins the group, and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Arti.
I'm going to build on that again. So I think the messaging and the positioning is super crucial for those ERGs in terms of things that you can do for free. So as part of our onboarding, people will do a session focused around our strategy and our values and behaviors. And at the end, we'll talk about the ERGs as well. And so we'll literally call them out and say, we have Women of Culture AMP. We'll go through all the list and we'll say, and there's Camp ID for inclusive disabilities, which includes, and we'll sort of talk through some things. And what's so funny is then about a week later, and it always tends to be about a week, you'll see in a private Slack group or workplace or Teams or whatever you use, suddenly someone just joins or gets invited because they've kind of gone through that process of saying, okay, there's something there and I sort of align with that. And then they kind of build up the courage, and they might talk to some of their, like a friend or buddy at work, and then they join. And then when they join, it's that moment of people then welcoming them and sharing and talking that, and just creates this sort of loop that then means people want to then talk about it more externally, and then recruits more people into that kind of ERG. And so that's free, and that's just about putting it on day 2 of someone's onboarding. Suddenly creates that space and creates that positioning that it's something that's very important. Hi, George.
Well, I think there's some great ideas there. Are there any? One more question. I think, Bruce, you had a question, am I correct?
Yeah. I don't know if it'll be... Maybe the audience could boo when I... but I wonder how you reconcile, like if we're talking about a difficult economic climate, and that's for businesses as much as for individuals, how does each of the organisations reconcile this inner conflict of care and accountability? Caring for the individuals, and accountability, people have got to get a job done. How do you find the balance of holding people accountable for getting their job done while being empathetic to their challenges?
It's a great question.
Just start. I don't think I have the answer, but I'll start.
Some people didn't hear the question, so let me try and paraphrase. Essentially, how can you both care for people but also hold people accountable for performance and results in an organization? How do you hold that tension?
I mean, you have to find a balance, and that doesn't answer the question, but I literally was I had a conversation yesterday with someone who writes for Harvard Business Review, and they're actually, I probably shouldn't say this, but they're working on an article right now that talks about what's the role of the manager, and is it a manager or a therapist, and what's the balance. And the conversation that we had yesterday was very much on understanding where the line is. So when you feel like, as someone involved in caring for other people in the office, in your teams, you have to have that sense check almost. Is this feeling like, okay, so-and-so's having a bad day today, or they've going through something and we can spend some time on it, plus we have to get our work done? Or is it feeling like that balance is off kilter? So am I having more of the conversation on what's the circumstance and what's happening versus what actually needs to get done, and being able to bring that back, and then being able to lean on the support mechanisms that can help with the circumstance. So do you then hand off to the people partners? Do you hand off to things like your employee assistance program or medical pathways? Like, you have to know what's around you, and being able to take that litmus as to when's it my job, when's it's not. And if you really can't, if individuals can't get their work done, or if that sense of meeting the requirement of what has to be done, then it's do we need to have a conversation about adjustments that we need to make so that I can then plan accordingly? And I think sometimes you have to just be honest about the fact that we are here to do a job, and I am compassionate and empathetic, but I am also balancing this and being honest about it versus dancing around the topic. I mean, I feel like that doesn't answer the question because it's a hard one to answer, but yeah.
Rebecca? Thanks, Arti.
I'm going to make this sound really straightforward. Caring for people equals profit. It's that visceral. You can add up the productivity savings that you make from having a workforce in a positive state of well-being and equate it to a number that hits your P&L account. And you know, we've seen this in a few different ways, both in physical health and in mental health in our organisation. Simple things like looking at areas where the NHS has lengthy waiting lists and choosing to provide that care in a different way to get people well and back to work quicker saves you an awful lot of sick pay and lost time through productivity, and also encouraging sort of therapies that enable people to still work whilst they're unwell. So that's sort of the sort of top quadrant on Nick's chart, I think is really important. And getting managers to see that actually well-being is a route to better profit, particularly in an organisation where we have a lot of traders in the supermarket space who like to see pound signs. It makes it easier when you can show them that, you know, A leads to B. And it's just being able to show them the numbers, I think, sometimes, which might sound very commercial and hard-faced, but sometimes you have to go there.
Yeah. I mean, just what I'm hearing there, it's not an either or, it's a both. It should be a both and. Nick?
Yeah, I think ROI. So going back to what Dr. Nick's excellent slide earlier was, you know, you can't manage what you can't measure. And so I think everyone in this room has a high conviction rate that this, align with what you just said, that actually this is not only the right thing to do, but actually leads to kind of healthier, more productive workforces. But you have to measure it, otherwise you'll just get eviscerated in the boardroom in terms of against all the other business metrics that are then kind of put forward, you know, as any organisation kind of runs. And so, you know, thinking about actually can you link and show the ROI of those wellbeing programs against, I don't know, performance management scores, against your attrition rates, against, you know, how people's onboarding scores are at 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. But actually putting some hard ROI data around it. And I think that's the next phase of where this journey is going. And I think there's a lot of people out there that kind of get it, but actually now we've got to translate that into those kind of hard facts that then can be discussed alongside other business metrics, so that when there's economic kind of clouds on the horizon, it doesn't get lost or seen as like a secondary thing. It has to be seen as something that's actually going to drive people through.
I can see one more thing to add.
Yeah, I think there's something, you know, that I don't know if it was Cameron or someone in the government spotted around happiness a while back, but we've seen a direct correlation in our business between spend level of our social fund. We have a small social fund for partners to use on parties or, you know, whatever it might be, a very small fund. But there's a direct correlation between how much of that social fund has been spent and the productivity of our branches. And those who haven't spent their social fund are bottom of the charts in productivity. And there, you know, the data is there, it's plain.
Some powerful answers, thank you. And thank you for your questions in the audience. So we're coming to the end now. I want to just finish with one last question with a short and punchy answer. I'd like you to imagine that you've time traveled 3 years into the future, and workplaces are, regardless of what's going on around them, having a net positive impact on the well-being of all their people. So just by virtue of being in that workplace, it's having a net positive impact on their well-being. What key shift has happened between now and 2026 for this aspirational reality to have come to fruition? So just what one key shift has happened? Who would like to start and answer that? Rebecca, it seems like you're ready.
Oh my God. I think for me, it would be down to the organisation continuing to live its purpose. I don't think there's one single thing. I think it's about a mass movement. Everyone has to be bought into it, and definitely meeting them where you find them to bring them into it. But it will take a seismic shift for the whole organisation to feel the same about this stuff, I think. But I think we can get there.
Arti, thanks, Rebecca.
super controversial. But jobs like ours don't exist anymore because they don't need to, because cultures have just got it. And they understand that actually well-being isn't about the benefits and the support and stuff that you have in place, but actually it's about the culture that you create and what your actual job looks and feels like on a day-to-day. And that has nothing to do with us. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Nick?
I think in 3 years, everyone has moved on from this liminal state, in that I still think that there is a huge tension between legacy cultures and organizations and generations that are sort of saying, oh, this will pass. And all of these requests for the 4-day work week or whatever it may be, that all just flexible work, remote work, is going to pass. We'll all be back in the office in kind of 2 years' time. I think in 3 years' time, if we've got to the point where people have actually kind of let go and said, no, actually, this is where we are, this is the reality, that actually maybe then this conversation is kind of moved forward, because there's a lot of tension on both ends at the moment.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Well, a round of applause for our fantastic panel guests today.